Okay, so hopefully you've watched the last few videos in which we have laid out all the alleged errors within Matthew. And in the last video, we actually were able to resolve the first two alleged errors. So in this episode now, we will be addressing the third error. So let's wipe the board. So we're specifically dealing with this episode, the three messing generations between Joram and Uzziah. These generations being Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah. So why has Matthew skipped 3 generations? Is this not an error? And the most annoying part of this alleged error is that so few scholars are willing to admit that it is in fact an error. And let me give you a few examples. For instance, Turner in his commentary writes, "But this is not that Matthew has erred, since he did not intend to work exhaustively and precisely." So in other words, Matthew hasn't included every name because he did not intend to work exhaustively. Similarly, Hagner writes, "Matthew is under no obligation to include every name contained in his source." So these two scholars, Turner and Hagner, are saying basically the same thing. Matthew is under no obligation to include every name in the genealogy. Scholars will also refer to places in the Old Testament where genealogies do this. For instance, Cook will say, "It would be incorrect to conclude from this that the writer somehow made a mistake, for there are other examples in the biblical record in which names were intentionally omitted from the genealogical listing." And Cook refers to 1 Chronicles 6 and Ezra 7, in which we have 2 genealogies of Levi, but the Ezra one has omitted 6 names. So scholars will say 2 things. Not only do we have precedent for this in the Old Testament, but it's obvious that Matthew is under no obligation to include every name. Now, I totally disagree with these scholars. Totally. Everything on this slide, I just disagree with them. And the reason why I disagree with them so much is because Matthew gives us a number. What do I mean by that? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say there's a guy called Henry. And Henry has his great-great-grandfather called Bob. And there are 5 generations between Henry and Bob. There are 5 generations between Henry and Bob. But Henry wants to convince people that he's special. And 5 simply isn't a special number. So he begins telling people that there are in fact 3 generations between him and Bob. Because, obviously 3 is a very special number. So he goes around telling people that there are 3 generations between him and Bob, and this makes him special. His friends are a bit confused by this, so they go and they dig around and they find Henry's genealogy. And they see that in fact there are 5 generations separating Henry and Bob. So they confront Henry and say, "What's going on, mate?" And Henry responds, "Slow down. Don't you see, I'm simply not counting my grandfather and my great-grandfather. And if you don't count those 2 generations, then you can recount my entire genealogy, and you can see that there are in fact 3 generations between me and my great-great-grandfather." How do you think his friends would respond to that? This is obviously totally illegitimate. This is an error. Because if you're going to give us a genealogy and then tell us the number, that number has to reflect how many generations there are. You can't omit any. So let's now go to Matthew. Matthew wants to tell us that there are 14 generations between David and the exile. But in fact, there are 17 generations between David and the exile. So what Matthew does is he changes this 17 to a 14. And he does this by excluding 3 names. And by so excluding them, he is able to recount the genealogy in order to now make it 14. Something fishy is going on here. And it is very strange that scholars are so hesitant to even acknowledge this. I did find one scholar from the 18th century who was willing to acknowledge this. He writes, it would have ill-suited the grave character of an apostle and evangelist first to name generations at his own pleasure and then admire the equality of this 14. To put that in plain English, he's saying it's rather strange that Matthew has deliberately excluded 3 names in order to get 14 generations and then marvels at the fact that there's this pattern within the genealogy. The obvious response is, mate, you made that pattern. You have tampered with the genealogy in order to get that pattern. There's nothing marvelous going on here. So how are we going to resolve this issue? Can this issue even be resolved? There are basically 3 options, in my opinion. You can either say Matthew is being deceptive. You can either say Matthew made a mistake, or you could say there's a legitimate reason for why Matthew has done this. Let's start with the deception. So obviously, I'm going to refer to Bart Ehrman. I love Bart Ehrman. He writes, in 1:8, he indicates that Joram is the father of Uzziah. But we know from 1 Chronicles 3:10 that Joram was not Uzziah's father, but his great-great-grandfather. In other words, Matthew has dropped 3 generations from the genealogy. Why? The answer should be obvious. If he included all the generations, he would not be able to claim that something significant happened at every 14th generation. So Ehrman here is saying that Matthew has excluded these names in order to convince his audience. In other words, you could say to trick his audience into thinking that there are in fact 14 generations and 14 is special. And what you'll actually find is that even conservative scholars are going to make this deception argument, even though they probably don't even realize what they're doing. For instance, Kaiser, in his book, Hard Sayings of the Bible, he writes, abridgment is the general rule in biblical genealogies. Thus, for example, Matthew 1:8 omits 3 names between King Joram and Uzziah. Between King Joram and, I don't know how he spelled that, Uzziah, Amaziah, Joash, Amaziah, whatever. In Matthew 1:11, Matthew omits Jehoiakim. He then writes, Matthew's goal is to reduce the genealogies to a memorable 3 sets of 14 individuals. For 14 is the number of David, D equals 4, V, or the Hebrew wow is 6, and the last D equals 4 for a total of 14. Kaiser thinks he's applying an apologetic to this error, but in my mind he's actually admitting that this Matthew is deceiving people. Matthew has excluded names in order to get it to 14. Note that in our previous video we actually resolved the verse 11 omission of Jehoiakim, so we can resolve that one. But the 3 generations is more difficult, and here Kaiser is saying that Matthew is in a sense tricking his audience. So what do we do with this? For many people, including myself, I am very hesitant to say that Matthew is tricking people, even though frankly that's what it looks like. So what are we to say? Well, let's go to our second option. Perhaps Matthew made a mistake. Now this is for many people not any more palatable, but let's at least consider it, because it is convincing in a way. Here are the names: Joram, Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and the red names are those that Matthew has excluded. Now, what you should notice is that Ahaziah and Uzziah, even in English, look similar. You'll actually find in some English translations, Uzziah is written with an A instead of a U, and in which case Uzziah and Ahaziah looks even more identical. And that's because the underlying Hebrew is very similar, and furthermore, in the Septuagint, in some versions of the Septuagint, they actually have the same spelling. So the argument is that Matthew has this section of scripture in front of him when he's writing his genealogy. And what happens is because Ahaziah and Uzziah look so similar, perhaps in Matthew's version they actually have the same spelling. Matthew's I accidentally slips from Uzziah to Jotham. He just skips it. Now, you might say that this sounds like a long stretch, but scholars actually put this as a reasonable option. For instance, Davis and Allison write, someone's I may have slipped from Ahaziah to Uzziah. Such an accident could be attributed to the redactional level, to Matthew's source, or to a copy of the Septuagint. So either Matthew made this mistake, or perhaps the copy of Matthew's Septuagint had this mistake. I actually like that second option, that the Matthew's copy of the Septuagint had this mistake. I think it's very unlikely that Matthew himself made this mistake, and this is because, as Davis and Allison write, in the view of the evangelist's manifest wish to have 14 names between David and the captivity, it is better to discern design rather than a fortunate accident without which there would be no 3 times 14 pattern. In other words, it just seems too unlikely that Matthew made a mistake and arrived at a pattern that he wished, that he explicitly tells us that he wants to reach. It just does not seem likely that that is an accident. Either the Septuagint, the version of the Septuagint that he has this error, or we go back to option 1, it's deception. So there's your second option. It could be a mistake based on Uzziah and Ahaziah looking similar. Okay, let's now go to the third option, which is there's a legitimate reason for Matthew changing it.